A common theme in many past videos that I've made is regarding intellectual development or different intellectual developments rather, about the development of certain ideas, how they stem from one another and the context within which they develop. We can codify some of these intellectual developments, or rather the patterns that are consistent with the development of these ideas and these concepts within certain laws. And there are 6 such laws which I've come to consider as essential to understanding intellectual developments, how they occur, the mechanisms through which they occur, their characteristics, etc., etc. To begin with, I think it is important to define what exactly I am referring to here. When I talk about intellectual development and the laws of intellectual development, I am referring specifically to ideas in relation to their historical development, stemming from one development to another, being able to trace these historical developments within their context and how they fundamentally stem from one another. Of course, in and of themselves, these ideas may be immaterial imaginations of the mind, but in relation to human beings and the people who produce them and the way that they play out over time and in terms of their historical development, they do have a very real quote-unquote extramental or real impact upon the world. And we can trace their development insofar as to how they are produced, or the sequence of events or the context within which those ideas develop. It is important to note that the framing is important here. Rather than viewing the development of these ideas as discrete developments, it is important to view them as continuous and organic developments. Like I've said, they stem from one another and they are not just produced in a vacuum. The first intellectual development, or the first law of intellectual development that I would give is as follows. Every intellectual development can simultaneously be considered a break from and extension of a tradition or traditions, quote unquote, already present system of thought or of a broader philosophy. An historical example of this that I would give is the American Revolution or the development of the American philosophical or political project. That project very much is a breakaway from the British development, but it is also an extension of some of the most fundamental aspects of the British political tradition. It is a breakaway from the British political tradition as it abstracts many of its ideals away from its basis within the ethnic or cultural identity of the British. It abstracts it away from the institutions of the British, which the writers or many British thinkers felt gave rise to the stability which led to the development of many of these concepts. For example, the institution of the monarchy or certain other institutions. In that sense, it is a breakaway from it. And fundamentally, of course, the Americans have to define themselves in contradistinction to the British. Otherwise, on a very ethnic basis, they are very much Englishmen. They are of British origin. So they have to abstract their political tradition away from mere identity. And this is why the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence is based on these broader ideological and specifically philosophical and more abstract terms, and isn't necessarily based on a kind of ethnic claim. It is based on these propositions of all men being created equal by their creator, endowed with the same rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, at the same time, it is an extension of these quote-unquote traditions. It is a natural extension and expansion upon the British and broader Enlightenment projects of the West, because it very much contains within it these kinds of liberal principles, these ideas of individualism, the value of the individual before God, the respect for human life, the respect for human dignity, and the respect for human liberty as a fundamental right of man. These concepts were already present amongst many strands of Western philosophy, but the American project took them to its logical conclusion in many ways and embedded those concepts within its political project. And it is very unique in that regard in all of world history indeed. The second law that I would give is that it may retain and expand upon certain aspects of said tradition, yet not retain or break away from other certain aspects of said tradition. So this is the second law, and it very much is just expanding upon the first law. But like I mentioned, the American political project retains many of these fundamental aspects of the British political or philosophical project, but it breaks away from it. It doesn't retain some of these other aspects, for example, the institutional monarchy or the kind of ethnic identity which is integral to the British peoples. And again, like I said, the American project very much is a kind of abstraction of it. It breaks away from this kind of ethnic or cultural identity as the basis of that nation, but rather it's based upon this set of propositions. It's a very much propositional identity, yet it retains some of those aspects of the broader Western tradition as well, such as individualism, etc., and reinforces it and expands upon it. Then the third law very much reinforces this point, whereby they expand upon or fully realize aspects of an ideal or system of thought, which may have not been fully apparent before or realized to its logical conclusion. Like I said, the American project takes many of these propositions and very much takes them to its logical conclusion, where all men are created equal before God, and they are all endowed by their creator with the same inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it makes it the basis of the American political project. As for number 4, it is as follows. These developments do not occur within a vacuum, but rather within some kind of context. Thus, all developments stem from something, whether it be a reaction to that something or a continuation of it. This is important because even though many ideas or many sorts of new philosophies or new systems of thought will claim to be a reaction to something or in opposition to something or a break away from something, in many cases what it doesn't want to admit is that that system of thought owes a lot of its intellectual legacy or its ideas to the thing which it claims to oppose or break away from, whether implicitly it embodies many of the aspects of that system of thought, or whether it defines itself in reaction to that thing. For example, we can view things like Marxism, let's say, or certain leftist paradigms. Of course, they may view themselves in opposition to some of the earlier or the present at the time economic models such as capitalism, yet it shares at times a lot more with things like capitalism than it wants to admit. For example, they both have a fundamentally materialist view of the world. Many times they share some of the same or if not similar philosophical presuppositions. For example, many of these modernist ideologies, whether they very strongly disagree with one another or not, fundamentally borrow or are based within the context of the Enlightenment project. And this is why they share many similar presuppositions. For example, they both, or many of them, will claim to be based on the scientific project. They both will have a materialist worldview. They just differ on the logical conclusions or the conclusions that they derive from those things, or how best to achieve certain end goals. This actually raises the fifth point, which actually comes into play with certain materialist paradigms actually, that intellectual developments have a symbiotic relationship with the material, spiritual, and collective mental and moral conditions of the outside world, and of peoples and societies, thus having a symbiotic effect on one another. This is pretty obvious that both the material and the ideal have a symbiotic relationship, and they affect the development of one another. Certain ideas will give rise to certain projects or certain movements or certain events which will bring about great effects on the material world or the outside world. And certain events within the material world will lead to the rise of new ideas, of new philosophies. And this is a pretty obvious historical development that has occurred. An obvious example here can be considered with things like Marxism or certain leftist ideologies. But even things like the Enlightenment project itself were attempts to solve some of the biggest questions that Europe faced. and they were intellectual developments stemming from the fundamental conflicts that occurred within European civilization as a whole. Of course, this may be a kind of synthesis, or it may solve a lot of the common arguments about what exactly drives the processes of history. Some may advocate for a kind of dialectical idealism, or some may advocate for a kind of dialectical materialism. But in reality, as I've discussed in past videos, one reality can have multiple aspects or multiple dimensions to it, and multiple processes can play out within the same reality. Hence, a given reality can have an idealistic kind of lens or aspect or angle to it, and simultaneously have a very material aspect to it. Both of these things don't necessarily have to contradict one another. They both can play out in different processes that affect that given reality. And finally, regarding the sixth point and the last point, any intellectual development can be contextualized within these conditions and can be understood within the context of continuing or constituting said developments, or whether it be in opposition to a certain development, or whether it be a continuation of that development. And like I said, even many developments which may view themselves as breakaways from something will still owe a lot of its intellectual legacy to that thing, whether it wants to admit it or not. And in many cases, you can trace the development of these ideas and how by taking certain aspects of these ideas and dragging them to its logical conclusion, you can create new ideas, in fact. This is something which is important to know, that many new or many novel ideas, in fact, may be developments or continuations or opposition to an already established idea. Of course, this isn't to downplay or deny that novel ideas or new ideas can come into existence or people can develop these new ideas. But in many cases, these new or novel ideas owe a lot to already established ideas, in fact, and they aren't just produced in a vacuum. An interesting way to expand upon this is to give the example of the isnad system, where in Islamic sort of sciences or within the Islamic tradition, you have the concept of the isnad, the chain of transmission. And generally speaking, one aspect of this is that scholars attempt to trace where distortions or where changes of a certain narration within that chain of transmission occur. And the concept of the isnad isn't just specific to the hadith literature. It also plays a part partially in books of historiography and heresiography, where scholars attempt to trace the development of certain quote-unquote heretical ideas from different individuals from one to another, but they also attempt to trace how those ideas developed over time, because those ideas don't remain static, they don't just stay the same. They develop, change, get expanded upon from one individual to another as different individuals add different concepts, they develop new ideas, they break away from certain pre-established ideas to form their own ideas, etc., etc. And in reality, this applies to all ideas, whether they be orthodox or unorthodox, or whatever you want to categorize them as. All ideas go through these intellectual developments, and somewhere down the chain, somewhere down that line of transmission, people add new concepts, people develop new concepts, people subtract or add new things, people break away from those already established ideas, people add variations, for example. And so it's important to note how these developments occur over the course of history.